Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this panel about travel, wandering, and literature. This is just really a little glimpse into a huge and very diverse subject. There are many different ways and reasons to travel, by choice or by force, because of political reasons. How do different places and circumstances affect literary work? How does traveling influence writing? And how do movements around the globe change literature in a broader sense? These are just some of the topics we want to discuss today with our guest authors. Intan Paramaditha, joining us from Australia, and Helon Habila, joining us from Washington, DC in the US. It's wonderful to meet you both, and I'm very happy that despite the fact that we cannot meet in person, we are at least able to look at the pixels of our faces. Well, once again, thank you, Intan and Helon, for accepting our invitation and being here with us today. You both are not only authors, but also travelers, and you live in changing places. And at least one of these places is not the place you originally come from. You both write about travels or the different ways and reasons to travel or wandering. But before we start, let me introduce our two guests to you. Ladies first. Intan Paramaditha is a writer and an academic and is originally from Indonesia, but lives in Australia. Her novel, The Wandering, published by Harvill Secker and Penguin Random House in the UK, translated from the Indonesian language by Stephen J. Epstein, was nominated for the Stella Prize in Australia and awarded the Tempo Best Literary Fiction in Indonesia, the English Pen Translates Award, and Penheim Translation Fund grant from PEN America. She's the author of the short story collection Apple and Knife and the editor of Deviant Disciples, Indonesian Women Poets, part of the Translating Feminism series of Tilted Access Press in the UK. She holds a PhD from New York University and teaches media and film studies at Macquarie University in Sydney. Once again, welcome, Intan. Helon Habila was born in Nigeria. He's a professor of creative writing at George Mason University in Virginia in the US. He studied at the University of Jos in Nigeria and the University of East Anglia in the UK. He is the author of 4 novels, of which the latest is Travelers, published by W.W. Norton in the US and Penguin Random House in the UK in 2019. He edited the Granta Book of the African Short Story, Granta Books in the UK in 2010, and the British Council anthology NW14, the Anthology of New Writing, also published by Granta Books in the UK in 2006. Habila's work has won many awards, including the Kane Prize in 2001 and the Wyndham Campbell Prize in 2015. From 2013 to 14, Habila was a DIAD Fellow in Berlin. Helon Habila is a regular contributor to the London Guardian and the New York Times. He's been a contributing editor to the Virginia Quarterly Review since 2004, and his works have been translated into German, among them his latest novel, Travelers. My name is Claudia Kaiser. I'm in the management of the Frankfurter Buchmesse, and I'm also often on the road and mostly live in a place that is not my origin. And perhaps this is the reason why I was asked to moderate the session, or maybe because I'm very fond of red shoes. I'm sure Intan can relate to that. I want to start with asking you both a bit about your work. Intan, your first novel, The Wandering, is written in a very particular style, in a choose-your-own-adventure format. Depending on which part the reader chooses to read, they will read very different stories. That somehow matches the title Wandering. What's behind the story and the red shoes?
So thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you very much, Litprom, for inviting me and having me here. I guess before I start, I just want to say that I am at my home in Sydney, in Australia, and we know that Australia was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I will start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. I pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So in terms of the shoes, the Wandering, yeah, that's right. The Wandering is a book about travel. It's a reflection of travel and displacement, written in a format in which the reader can choose their own story, or in other words, choose your own adventure. And I feel that this structure allows us to really think about the idea of choices, the freedom to choose, and the limitation of that freedom. So it seems that within this global neoliberal world, there are so many choices, but actually those choices are already predetermined. They're already structured based on our gender, class, race, citizenship. And then I use the red shoes. I'm glad that you love the red shoes, Claudia. I do love the red shoes, but I also find that it's a very interesting motif in literature. We know Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Red Shoes. It has been made into a film as well. And of course, Dorothy's shoes in The Wizard of Oz. Even though in the novel, in the book, it's Ruby's slippers, but when it became a movie, you see this sparkling, beautiful red shoes. So I feel like the red shoes symbolizes women's desire for mobility. And women are often punished for that desire, because in the Red Shoes story by Hans Christian Andersen, you have this woman who cannot stop dancing with her red shoes, and she has to have her feet cut off. So the book explores this motif of women traveling, the desire for mobility, and also it poses critical questions about this desire, about the politics and privilege of travel.
And do you also want to say a few words about the structure of the story?
Yeah, so it begins with this woman who lives in Jakarta in Indonesia as, I would say, a member of the common people. She is stuck with her career. She cannot go abroad because economically she is not in that position of privilege. So basically, in being stuck, she just wishes for a devil to come and change her life. And yeah, the devil comes, and there's this Faustian story of a woman bargaining with the devil, and the devil fulfills her wish to travel by giving her a pair of red shoes. So with her red shoes, she can travel anywhere. So she is transported to, and you can choose with your choice, she can be in New York or she can be in Berlin, and then later she would end up somewhere else, in Peru or Amsterdam. But the problem is with the red shoes, it can only take you that far. When you are there without network, without security, you are basically lost. So that's what our protagonist experiences. She has to make choices to survive, basically, including, for instance, overstaying her visa or marrying a white man, basically doing all the things to secure her place, because she has no network, she has no connection. So so the book is really about that kind of adventure or misadventure, where you travel as a brown woman from the global South.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. And Helon, you were, Intan was just mentioning traveling as a brown woman from the global south. So your work is also much about that. It's much clearer in its structure. The stories of the people you are portraying are very intriguing, extremely touching and captivating. And the main character seems to have some resemblance with yourself when you were in Berlin. And at some point, the main character is also somehow wandering into a detention camp. Tell us a little bit about the background for your novel, please.
Well, thank you very much for your question. And thanks to Litprom for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be doing this. And like I told you before, this is my second time doing an event for Litprom. Yeah, my book, Travelers, as the name implies, is about people traveling in a kind of general sense of travel, but my focus is mainly about migration and migrants, and specifically African migrants going from Africa to Europe, which was, a phenomenon that's quite topical and in the news, especially in the last, say, about 10 years now. It's been there, and of course it's going to be with us for a very long time to come. It's not something that's going to go away. So it's become something that defines our times and the nature of the way we live, and the makeup of our societies are affected by these migrants. So little background about how I came about this story is I was in Berlin, like you said, 2013, 2014, and I was invited by a newspaper there to write about a recent tragedy that happened in 2013 when a boat capsized in the Mediterranean. And that's how I started researching and interviewing migrants who, I must say that before that incident, before that invitation, I hadn't really seen, even though they were there everywhere in Berlin. So afterwards, I started seeing them everywhere because now they were visible to me. They were not just statistics or news in the papers. They were actual human beings after I had met them. And as an African, of course, I felt viscerally connected to the story itself. And so that's where I got the idea, even though I had gone to Berlin to write a totally different book for my fellowship. But then I decided that was the story I couldn't keep away from. It's something that you see and you cannot unsee. So a lot of the stories in the book are based on my interviews with these migrants, not just African, but also, Syrians, other people from other countries as well. I interviewed them and decided to turn most of the stories into a novel, even though the stories are kind of different and individual and disparate, but I had to find a connection between these stories. And there was that connection, which is they're all traveling. They're all trying to find a new home in a new place, and they're facing almost similar challenges, about documentation, about being visible outsiders and minorities, and facing, sometimes the distrust and the challenges that comes with their situation and their condition. So that was, for me, what was captivating. And then, of course, I had to change all of that into fiction, into stories, because I realized that my duty as a writer is to entertain and to educate, to some level, but I had to make this story interesting as well, even though it's a very, very serious and sometimes depressing narratives. I had to make it interesting, and that's where the craft of writing comes in. You have to talk about characterization, make your characters compelling and interesting. You have to talk about plot, so the reader can pick your book and not put it down because of the plot. Something always is happening. So in a way, that's how the structure of the book came about. which, if you remember, I arrange in books. There's book 1, book 2, book 3, up to book 6. And sometimes you have different narrators in the different books, even though there's one major character who kind of runs through all the books, but some of the stories have different focal points. So it was intentionally a kind of multifocal book, because I wanted to give the totality of this experience of these people of travel. So many things I think I was conscious of as I was writing the book, you know, in terms of history, of where these people are coming from Africa, which are mostly colonized, you know, by European powers. And if you remember, Berlin itself, you know, was the venue in 1884 for what we call the Berlin Conference, or what sometimes is called the Congo Conference. And that's where most of these countries were demarcated by European powers. So there is that connection to the past. And I think one of the points I was trying to make in the book is that the past is never past. Like Faulkner says, the past is not even past. History is not history. The past is not even past. So whatever happened in the past determines the future. And most of these countries, what they're going through now was determined by their situation as colonized countries. So these are some of the things that were going through my mind, and I want the reader to kind of recognize when he reads the book or when she reads the book.
Yeah, it's done very well. Since you wrote that book in Berlin, may I ask you, what does Berlin mean to you?
What does Berlin mean to me? Oh, beautiful city. Nice people. So before I went in 2013 and 2014 for my fellowship, of course, I had been to Berlin, but only briefly for the Berlin Literature Festival, once or twice. So I had never lived in Berlin. And I really didn't know what to expect, because I had never thought I would ever like live in Germany for 1 year. So there was that apprehension. I was apprehensive, but then I got to live there and to make friends and to meet people. And I went with my family, with my children, and they quite loved it. There are so many institutions and organizations that are friendly to the arts, especially the DAAD. We lived in a kind of community of writers and composers, movie directors. So we were living in a kind of bubble, which I realized was not the real Berlin, you know, because it was quite privileged. And so I was quite aware of that. But once in a while, you get a glimpse of the real Berlin and the real people. So I enjoyed that 1 year. It was a beautiful time for me.
Yeah, and Intan, in your novel, Berlin also is mentioned, and your character is also in Berlin, comes to Berlin. What is your connection to Berlin?
Yeah, unlike Helon, I never really lived in Berlin, but I love the city a lot. And I felt that when I was writing my novel, so I visited Berlin when I was living in Amsterdam, actually. So, and I thought, but I love Berlin so much, I wanted to incorporate that in my novel. So I used the Berlin path. Well, there are many paths. There are 15 paths in the novel in which the reader can choose their stories. And in the Berlin path, it allows me to explore different categories of travel. So there are many travelers. So our protagonist, the one with the red shoes, which means you, the reader. So our protagonist is a traveler, but she also encounters other travelers and their own stories. And I use the Berlin path to talk about, first, there's this, the story of a refugee and how, so our protagonist meets an old man in the plane, where she tells the story about a Palestinian refugee in the 70s living with his German wife, and both of them have they had their traumas, the Holocaust trauma and the trauma of the Nakba, which makes the relationship very complicated. And at the same time, the Berlin path is also used in the story to talk about the experience of being a tourist. And I was a tourist in Berlin, and I feel like that idea of being a tourist should be discussed, because we often take things for granted, but tourism is really important, and it should be a place where we question our gaze. I mean, John Urry, the sociologist, talks about the tourist gaze, how the way we see spaces are constructed. It's already constructed, and we should really question our gaze whenever we visit a place. So there's one moment in the story where the protagonist and her lover visit the Holocaust memorial, and then there are so many questions that that she has to confront, like how are you supposed to relate yourself to that history, that traumatic history, as a, I would say, as an audience, as someone from the outside. How do you see that place? How do you position yourself there? Is that place just some kind of spot in your itinerary, which is that's another kind of horror, I think. Like, what does it mean to go to traumatic sites, like you know, maybe visiting the S21 prison in Cambodia? And then I noticed that when I was there, people started to take selfies, and even just the idea of taking photos of those places that are really that have this very traumatic history, where murders really they really took place there. I feel so uncomfortable with the idea of, you know, just seeing and well, let alone taking photographs. So yeah, long story short, yeah, that's the Berlin path allows me to explore different kinds of traveling position, including what it means to be a tourist.
Yeah, and being a tourist, when you live in different, or let's say in two locations, you, Helon, in mostly in the US, but also in Nigeria, and you, Intan, mostly in Australia, but also in Jakarta or in Indonesia. What does that, not just being in one location, what does that mean for your writing?
I guess you're asking
Helen,
me.
or
ask okay. Helon first.
Okay.
Yeah. So, what does being in these different locations mean for my writing? How does it affect my writing?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's important for writers to travel, to experience other cultures. It gives you a lot of exposure, and it you know, it doesn't mean that you are different from other travelers, because basically you have to experience the same things. Like, if you're a Black person traveling, whether you're a writer or not, you experience the same things that other Black people traveling experience. And you're always trying to create a new home for yourself. You're trying to reinvent yourself. So for me, I left Nigeria, I moved to England. Then from England, I moved to the US. Then from the US, you know, I was in Berlin for a while, and all these places. So there's that sense of being almost like a perpetual outsider. There's that difficulty of trying to get into the culture or to be accepted. There's no total acceptance, you know. So there's all that psychological distance that you have between you and the place. And there's also the nostalgia for the home that you left behind, which leaves a very big hole. It's almost a traumatic thing to leave your home country and to live in another place, because you can never go back. Even if you go back, there's going to be that hole that you can never, you know, bridge. So I'm quite aware of that. So I think I brought all of that experience into writing this book, especially travelers. And I guess that's why I could see these characters, because I did experience trying to invent myself, reinvent myself, and get a new home in a new place. But it's not always, you know, a negative thing to travel for a writer. You create a kind of distance, in a way, to place, especially your former place, your home country. And most of my novels are set in Nigeria, in Africa. And I think leaving Africa, leaving Nigeria has given me that almost objective distance to the setting of my stories. I don't know if it makes me a better writer, you know, but it gives me a kind of more objective gaze of plays. And there's that almost detachment to my subject matter that I think is very useful if you're going to see things more critically. So I've benefited from that, but there's always the whole, the nostalgia and the loneliness of being outside your place, outside your native place.
Mm. How do you feel about that, Intan?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So that, yeah, what Helen mentioned about nostalgia and the idea of wanting to participate in the new home, new culture, but you know that there's always, I mean, people welcome you, but there's always like an sort of an unseen barrier, whether that results from your feeling for the home country, nostalgia, and so on. So I feel like it's always that in-betweenness is something that we all experience as travelers. So so not being in one location, for me, it results in the condition of being what I call gentayangan in Indonesian language. So gentayangan is it's the original title of my novel, The Wandering. Gentayangan means, well, wandering, but in Indonesian language, and this is something that cannot be captured fully in the English language, is that gentayangan is the condition of being in between as ghosts, because ghosts are neither here nor there. They're not really part of the living, and they're not really part of the world of the dead, because they have, you know, unfinished business, or they're just not resting in peace. And I think traveling, while it connects peoples and cultures, and it has the potential to build a cosmopolitan solidarity, it produces that feeling and situation of gentayangan, of the in-between state, that you are always between homes. It seems that you have, I mean, like Helen, you have more than one home, and me too. I consider, well, Indonesia, first of all, as my home, but I feel like, because I lived in the US for about a decade, that's also my home, and Australia is my home too. But these homes are always floating, and in that in-between space, interestingly, you can be invisible too, like ghosts. So that idea of not being immersed fully in that place that you live in, and at the same time, you are detached from home. I mean, when I was in the US, I lived in Queens, which is a very diverse borough in New York City. And I made friends with Indonesians who are undocumented migrants, and they couldn't leave the US, because if they leave the US, then they wouldn't be able to return. So I also picked up their stories for The Wandering. And because they had left Indonesia since, I don't know, forever, maybe late 80s, talking to them feels like visiting a museum. Like your home in the late 80s is very much preserved in the memory. Yeah, that's what's really interesting, how you navigate these different homes. Yes, but so certainly being in more than one location, physically and mentally, it produces this strange feeling, but very productive as well. I mean, I use the concept of guntayangan or wandering to talk about many traveling subjects in the globalized world today.
So I suppose it would be, can you imagine, I mean, and now is a situation where you cannot travel, I suppose. How does that, do you have a feeling of how that will or how that is affecting your writing? Being in one place?
Yeah, Helen, you go first.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't know how it affects my writing, but I have this theory, you know. I think that we're going to have like a kind of post-pandemic literature in a way after COVID, and I don't know how that's going to be like, you know, in terms of style and also in terms of subject matter, you know, whether it's going to be this kind of airless, stifled sentences, you know, and shorter scenes and things like that. But it's definitely affecting our psyche in a way that we may not even be aware of at the moment. Because I haven't traveled in almost a year. And I used to travel almost, you know, every other month for conferences. So the writer would spend maybe a year trying to write their book in isolation. And then after they finish, they go to festivals and they meet people. And that's a big relief, you know, and you get recharged because you meet your friends, you meet colleagues, and you make connections. And it's a good thing. Your brain can breathe. But then now you don't have that, you know, you don't get to meet your audience physically and talk to them and get that love from them, you know. So all that is gone in this 1 year, and I think it's affecting us psychologically. We may not know how exactly it's doing that, but I like to think that, and I can bet that it's going to affect writing in some way. You know, I don't know if it's going to be on the sentence level or subject matter level, thematic level, but there will be that. So I'm kind of eager to see what's going to happen. Sorry, I don't know if that answers your question. I cannot say how it's affected my writing personally, because I haven't really produced any sizable work. I can't even think, you know, this isolation, almost all inspiration has sort of died. You know, I don't find it easy to get inspired to do any work because of this confinement. So I guess that's one way it has affected my writing. I don't write.
I think so. It sounds like it. Yeah. Intan?
Yeah, I can still write, but yeah, I think that's right. Like meeting your readers, being connected to other writers in festival. That's what's really missing from the writer's life. It's funny. So I had to list all my events, speaking engagements for university purpose for my workplace, and then I listed them all during, you know, all the events during COVID-19. And I was reminded that I listed names of festivals and places like Hong Kong, Scotland, Germany, but actually I didn't go there. I was in my living room doing the Zoom call. But that reminds me that exchange did take place. Some forms of exchange did take place, even though we still can't travel, and you can connect through technology. But yes, corporeality is irreplaceable. It's that physical contact with people and places, the land or the water. It's that contact that produces knowledge, right? It's corporeality produces knowledge, and that's something that we miss. And what I also noticed during the pandemic is that opportunities and the lack thereof and inequalities that we have online these often mirror the offline world, and that offline world is highly dependent on travel. So all the invitations I got to talk and meet, collaborate online during the COVID time, they all emerged from existing contexts that I had in the pre-COVID world. And those opportunities were there because I travel. And what about, so my question would be, what about, well, the people who didn't have the chance to travel that much before COVID, they wouldn't get this privilege. And also, yeah, we think that technology during COVID would allow, you know, transmission of knowledge exchange and other forms of knowledge production. But if we think about bandwidth, that's not equal. That's part of our problems with global inequalities. And some people can benefit from online interaction. I mean, all of us here in this event, we all benefit from this online interaction, but some others, they just don't get the same privilege. So for instance, I work with a lot of communities in Indonesia. I'm part of a collective that organizes a feminist festival in Indonesia, and I'm also the curator of Makassar International Writers Festival that promotes writers from Eastern Indonesia. And from these events that I co-organize, discrepancies are big problems. So for instance, if you want to promote someone in Eastern Indonesia, but they are not from big cities, from Makassar, they live in a village with difficult access to internet, there's a chance that the quality is not good. Probably their message can't be heard clearly by others, and they cannot benefit fully from these online events. So I guess, I mean, I talk about, it's really funny because people have been asking me, well, you talk about travel and we cannot travel during COVID-19. How is your work relevant? Well, I think we can still talk about problems with power structure and inequalities. They are still very much around, even when you cannot, even when you're at home. Mobility and circulation, they're still taking place. Ideas still circulate and people are still traveling virtually, but there are some people who do not have the same privilege of virtual travel.
Yeah. I want to take up something that you said earlier. Traveling creates cosmopolitan solidarity. And we all, I mean, the tourist industry is huge, and we now see how huge it is and what a loss it is that people cannot travel. And is that, do you think that, it's a question, do you think it is true that it creates that cosmopolitan solidarity? I mean, all together traveling, I'm sure it's true for you, but for most people. And do you think that traveling also means understanding other cultures, means immersing into other cultures, and hopefully also diminishing or decreasing, at least looking down on other cultures or even racism? Do you think that really happens? Because I feel that this world is becoming more racist, if you want, even though so many people travel on a regular and non-corona times. What do you think on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that idea of cosmopolitan solidarity is, it's my, I feel that's my aspiration as someone who has more than one home. I always feel like I want to connect and I always want to contribute to the society that I live in. And I think that's the ethics, the cosmopolitan ethics of being in the world. But traveling, I think it opens up that potential for cosmopolitan solidarity. But whether you pursue or whether you push that potential, it really depends, because it's really possible. I mean, right, you're right, Claudia. I mean, there are, we're still facing borders, we're still facing racist attitude. So it's really possible that you travel a lot, but travel doesn't change you. Travel simply confirms your pre-existing beliefs and assumption. It's like, you know, you've heard stories about, oh, I've lived in Bali for 10 years and I'm open-minded. So I feel like it doesn't happen automatically. It also sounds like, oh, my wife is Asian, so I can't be racist. I feel that a change in perspective requires hard work. So it's not just the traveling, but it's a reflection part of it. And that reflection cannot be self-centered. So a lot of the problem with a lot of traveling narratives is that it's very self-centered. It's about how have I changed? How do I discover myself? It's all about me. Whereas, what about the people who make your bed when you travel? What about the labor involved that makes your travel possible? So I guess it's really just the act of travel itself is not enough, because you can be, well, you know, just an example, there was a big story online, like an online debate about digital nomads who lived in Bali. So it was sparked by this story of American digital nomads. They sort of overstayed their visa, they lived in Bali, and then they tweeted, okay, come to Bali and enjoy this privilege, which is very, very problematic. What about the whole environment where you enjoy your privilege as expats? What about the environment that you live in? What do you contribute to them? So yeah, I guess now that we can't travel, it's really the time for us to question ourselves, to make further reflections of how we make meaningful connection with people. Yeah.
Helen, what are your views on that?
Yeah, I do agree with Intan. It's traveling is so, you know, unequal. That's the sad aspect of it. And who gets to travel, you know? And when they travel, what do they do when they travel? And I do agree that, you know, it's so self-centered. And I mean, I come from Nigeria, so you find a lot of expatriates, because we always talk about people coming from the southern, you know, part of the hemisphere to the west, to the north, but there are also people going to Africa and to Asia. And does it change them? You know, do they even see the natives when they go there? Mostly they stay in their little bubble in their 5-star hotels, you know, and they just go sightseeing. I don't know if it really changes them. I don't know if they really want to change. It's almost like going on a safari and just watching the, you know, the wildlife, and then you go back and say, oh yeah, I've taken this off my checklist. I've been to this country, I've been to that country. So that's interesting. And then you have the question of documents as well, the ease of travel. You have to go through so many hoops if you're going in the opposite direction. You're going to the north or to America or to Europe. It's harder to even get the opportunity to travel. You have to be vetted, you know, so many times before you get there. So there are only like a select people, the privileged ones, like the writers, you know, like the professors who get to travel. Whereas if it's in the other direction, it's different. They practically throw out the red carpet for you and welcome you when you travel. So you already have this mentality when you get there that you are just, you know, you're above the average person. So you know, like Intan said, it's almost more aspirational. One aspires to go and see the place and to learn about the place and to make meaningful connections with the place. But there are so many obstacles in one's path. It's never easy. You have to stay like a really long time in a place to really be able to imbibe most of the culture and to understand the place and to even to be accepted in that place. I mean, I remember my first time outside Nigeria, you know, we went to England, to East Anglia, Norwich. And for me, it was like going to another universe, you know, like going to another planet. Even the English that they spoke there was not the English I was used to hearing on BBC. So I couldn't even understand what they were saying. The food was totally different. So it was quite challenging to be able to live there. And then of course, one got transplanted again to America. Then I had to start adjusting to the culture, to the place, which is totally different from England. So there are all these challenges of building that solidarity. One may want to do that, but sometimes it's very hard to do.
Yeah. It's hard work, as you said.
Hard work, yeah.
Yeah. I want to also discuss with you the question of literature by refugees. I'm thinking of the asylum seeker Behrouz Boochani, who wrote No Friend But the Mountains via WhatsApp messages on an island in the Pacific where he was detained and had not been allowed to enter Australia, even though he won the Victorian Prize for Literature, which is worth 100,000 Australian dollars. What does this say about writing for refugees or by refugees, and about the acceptance and perception of writers who are in a refugee situation? And my next question, which would be connected to that, do you think that in the global publishing industry, there's more acceptance for this kind of writing?
I haven't read the book itself, but I've read a review of it by Jem Kutsia, I think, in the New York Times or in the Guardian. I can't remember. I think the title of the review is called Australia's Shame. So that says a lot. And it's about storytelling. You know, we're always grateful for that kind of narrative to be emerging from the insiders. The one thing I discovered while I was writing my book and while I was interviewing most of the migrants I met is their hunger to tell their story. And what I understood is that they telling your story validates you. You know, it's about identity making. It's about saying that I'm not just a statistic, I'm a human being. And this is the way I see myself. And I want you to see me the way I see myself. Whereas the media sees you as a statistic, the host nation that you're going into sees you as an undocumented, sometimes a menace. You know, have all the right-wing media calling you a threat or invader, all this language that's so pejorative that we throw about, but we never really see the people. That's the sad thing. So their stories, and that's what I intentionally wanted to do. Is a way of translating themselves. And I know that you are going to ask us a question about translation, but it's about translating your own experience for yourself and for the reader to tell them. And as they tell their stories, it almost gives them more courage. It reminds them of who they were and who they are. Because being an outsider, being a migrant has a way of eroding your confidence and your personality systematically. And the system is designed to do that by throwing you into camps, by, you know, you don't have a document. So you're kind of being erased systematically. So I think telling that story and reminding people and reminding yourself of who you are is very, very important. So I definitely appreciate that book, and I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Intan, do you like to add something to that? Or what is your view on that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful book, and I think it's such a shame the way that you know, it's already something really huge, and the Australian government basically didn't do much about the condition. I guess the value of the book was that it allowed us to see what really happened in Manus Island, because journalists couldn't go there. So and because of the use of technology, he was able to write what happened inside and tell the story through WhatsApp messages, which is like fantastic, like writing the whole novel through with your cell phone. It's just amazing. So I think this story is really important because now I guess the question of who's telling the story is getting more and more urgent. Well, first because the travel story, as I mentioned before, travel narratives have been predominantly about very self-centered narrative, finding yourself, who you are, very self-centered, self-searching is good, but you also need to be aware of the structures that allow that to happen, and also the people that the cultures that you encounter. And travel stories have been written, the dominant ones, the ones that circulate, they were mostly male and white travel stories. And even if we have women writing about travel, like Elizabeth Gilbert, for instance, a lot of the travel stories by these you know, white feminists, I would say, they're often framed within the neoliberal the neoliberal perspective, like how you articulate your feminist agency by going somewhere exotic and consuming the culture of the other. And so that's why I think Behrooz Buchani's book is an important intervention, because we need to hear from that subject position. And I guess you also asked about whether the direction of literature with the subjects like Buchani and the larger political movements. I think literature is changing. I mean, just the fact that Buchani received recognition, that's good, but I think literature in general needs a lot of work. It's changing, but quite slowly, not as fast as we expected. I mean, last year with the Black Lives Matter, I read news about how people in the publishing industry, writers, editors, they criticize the publishing industry for being too white, and therefore that affects the decision making. And some publishers finally said, okay, we're going to be more firm in terms of taking affirmative diversity action. Yeah, like getting more Black writers, and it's like, well, that's 2020. You could have done better, but yeah, but things are changing and changing for something more positive. Just not as fast as we expected.
Yeah, I hope we hear more of these stories and can read more of these stories in translation in many different languages in the nearer future. Well, I have one last question, and maybe that's a bigger question. And this is something that has been going on for or has been discussed quite often in the last few weeks, which is the question of the identity of, you were just talking about writers, who writes the story, and also who translates the story. So of course you all know about the recent uproar and the discussion about the translation of Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb, that she recited at Joe Biden's inauguration ceremony. And we can recall that in the Netherlands, the International Booker Prize winner Marieke Lucas Reinveld was asked by the publisher to translate the poem, and then she stepped back because of criticism that the work should be translated by someone or some team that has an identity that is closer to that of Amanda Gorman. Is identity more important than merit, experience, ability? Your views.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, in a more ideal world, I actually love that possibility for connection. I mean, there are two young writers from different cultural backgrounds. I mean, Amanda is African-American, she's an activist, and Marieke is, they identify as non-binary writers. So I feel that there's a lot of potentials there in terms of connection and exchange. But I am also aware that the field of literature in translation is really small, and it's, I mean, in the English language world of publishing, only 3%, I think you know this, Claudia, only 3% of the total work published in the English language market are works in translation. And most of these are dominated by European languages and by male writers. I'm not sure about the number of translation outside the English-speaking world, but I assume that most of the works translated are from the English language or from the US as the dominant country. So there's a lot of it's small, and that's why problems of inequalities are still characterizing the field. So yeah, I guess we are still dealing with the problem of not only who translates it, but what work gets translated, which country, and which authors. And now, going back to the case of Amanda Gorman, there are conversations among translators about how translators of color do not get the same opportunities in the world where, you know, translations are not really recognized or financially, I mean, recognized in terms of the effort, yeah, but the translators are not paid really well in general. So there's a problem. I think everything is kind of connected to the larger problem. I think we need to see it as a marker of the bigger structure about the problems with global literature and literature in translation, and why literature in translation is so marginalized. Is marginalized in the larger sphere, and that translates into all these other things, including who's translating it. And so yeah, so I would say, you know, Marieke and Amanda would be great together, but I can understand where the critique comes from. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Helon, do you have a say on your translator?
I don't really have a say. I think my German publisher is the one that chose my translator, and I'm happy that they chose her. She's quite good. Yeah, and to your question about Amanda Gorman, I totally agree with what Intan said. It's such a complex situation, and there are kind of historical inequalities that you cannot ignore, even though the ideal would be to get whoever is qualified, you know, and sometimes it's even good to get someone who is unlike yourself, unlike the writer, you know, different, to write it, so that there will be that exchange and reinvention of a work, so that you see the work through the eyes of another person from another culture, which I think gives the work a kind of renewed life, because it's interpretation, you know, interpret. So that's a beautiful thing. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the inequities that exist, especially in the publishing world, and the dominance of one, you know, group or class of people, mostly white male people, who have dominated it for so long. And so the question is, this group that's challenging, you know, the translator, or they want to translate it, are they as equally qualified, you know, as the person who was first chosen and had to step aside? Probably they are as qualified, you know, and the question is, why weren't they contacted in the first place? So that all these questions will arise. I guess the answer would be that because, you know, they weren't seen as ideal because of who they are. So you have to acknowledge that. And like I said, the past, the history is always impacting on the present. And it's a good thing if by protesting, by using this opportunity, they can thrust themselves, you know, into the forefront and kind of display their credentials and say, you know, why not us? So I see what they're doing. In an ideal world, you know, we shouldn't even be talking about this, because they should have a lot of opportunities as any other person, but they don't, and they didn't. And that's why we're having this discussion.
Well, thank you. I think there's a lot more to discuss on all of these issues, but unfortunately we've come to the end of the time that is allocated to us. It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing glimpses into your work, of your view of the world. That was very, very enriching. Thank you so much. And I really hope that we will see more and more translations into German, into all different languages. I mean, German still is a language which has a lot of, publishes a lot of translations. But we need more, and we need more from countries that are not being seen at this point, and from identities that are not being recognized. So, and Litprom is the organization that works very hard towards this goal. So, thank you so much for being with us, Intan and Helon. And thank you, audience, for listening to us. And I think Intan's work has not been translated into German yet, if I'm not mistaken. So hopefully that will be coming out soon. And Helon's novel is already published by Wunderhorn Verlag. So please have a look at these two novels. They are really very interesting and enriching. Thank you. And
thank you, Claudia.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Thank you, Helon.
Auf Wiedersehen.